Good afternoon and welcome to our 2020 MCAP Fall Webinar Series. Today we present the fourth webinar of a six-part series. Please visit our website at multilingualcalifornia.org for updates of upcoming webinars and additional resources. You may also subscribe for updates. Our next webinar will be on November 18th on Designated and Integrated SLD with GLAD en Español. My name is Dr. Alma Castro. I'm the director of the Multilingual California Project. MCAP is a 3-year grant awarded to CABE in March through the CDE Educator Workforce Investment Grant. The goals of the MCAP grant are to support professional learning opportunities for teachers, administrators, and paraprofessionals across the state for implementing the English Learner Roadmap Policy. The MCAP Alliance includes CABE and 5 county offices of education in Butte, Fresno, San Bernardino, Orange, San Diego, and San Diego State University. The MCAP builds on a robust body of research highlighting multilingualism as the most effective option for the academic achievement of English learners across content area and for the preparation to participate effectively in the global workforce. As we get ready for today's exciting session, I have a few housekeeping matters to share. After today's webinar, we will post the recorded version and resources on the multilingualcalifornia.org website so you can access the webinar, the recording, and other resources. We also invite you at the end of our presentation to please complete the survey. The link will be provided in the chat box. At this time, please sit back, relax, and get ready for 45 minutes of powerful online engagement and learning. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce and welcome my colleagues, Holly Harding from Butte County, Lisa Clark from Fresno County, and Angelica Hurtado from San Bernardino County, who will be presenting today on supporting English learners in a rural setting. Welcome, Lisa, Angelica, and our first presenter, Holly Harding. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Alma. And thank you to CABE for organizing this fall webinar series. My name is Holly Harding, and I'm the Title III Specialist for Region 2. I'm based out of Butte County Office of Education, and in my role as the Regional Specialist, I serve the 9 northern counties of Region 2. I'm happy to be presenting to you today. My portion of the presentation will be followed by Lisa Clark from Fresno, and then Angelica Hurtado from San Bernardino County. She'll be with you for the final portion of this presentation. Next slide, please. Our norms for this presentation are pretty straightforward. You're already muted, but we do hope that you will use the chat box to ask questions or show your support for a particular point, or even share resources that you think are relevant for this content with other participants today. Feel free to chat us your name and where you're joining us from. We would love to hear from you. Next slide, please. We will be highlighting 3 strategies for our rural communities today: connecting with families, ensuring access for content learning, and providing contextualized language instruction. Also, resources and links for further study have been embedded in this slide presentation. And upon conclusion of this webinar, a PDF will be sent to you as well as posted on our website, multilingualcalifornia.org, where you can access the many resources we referred to today. Next slide, please. What do we mean when we talk about rural communities? We're talking about low incidence schools or districts. This can be sometimes just a 1-school district like a K-8 or a high school. We're referring to communities with low numbers of EL students in their schools and also in the surrounding area. Because the numbers of ELs are low, it could be a community where the population is shifting and the EL community is growing. Where there were not EL students before, maybe there's a sudden influx due to economic factors. Either way, we're not talking about urban or even suburban schools or districts. Next slide, please. So some of the things that we should all understand about rural communities is that they are often far from a city or a town. This could mean that they're also far from retail stores or shopping centers. Some communities are considered geographically isolated. When I think of this, I think of the north coast of California, the Humboldt Coast, or up near Del Norte, or even our far eastern desert communities. Our rural communities have low density of population in general. For many, the reason for that is that the land is used for agriculture, for farming and ranching. In fact, California has approximately 100 million acres of land, and approximately 40% or 43 million acres are used for agriculture. Next slide, please. I just love these photos. This is why we're so fortunate to live in California. Whether you live in an area that's farming hay or grapes, or if you live in the high desert of Eastern California or the North Coast, you're surrounded by California's immense beauty. I consider it an absolute privilege to serve my community, the 9 counties of Northern California. And honestly, these pictures look exactly like my commute as I drive out to serve our rural population. I know it's the same for many of you as you drive to your school or to your district. Next slide. So we've already talked about rural schools and the low enrollment of EL students, but one thing to remember is that when the EL population has not been present in a school before, and then there is 1 or 2 English learners or a family that moves in, there are not necessarily the resources or programs in place for a school to meet the needs of those 2 or 3 students. So the work begins for these schools to reach out, usually to their county offices, for support with investigating curriculum, finding translators, and developing programs for EL students that have arrived at their doorstep. Some of these students may not have the language resources to access the school's current programs. On the school side, they may not have the resources in place to meet the needs of the students. So this is where the mismatch lies. Our role as county offices is to provide the guidance and to make suggestions, but we're not the bodies in the classroom. So small schools are often on their own with this process, and it can be daunting. Next slide. So we already talked about how some small school districts may not have programs in place until students arrive. And one area where that is most noticeable is with bilingual programs or dual language programs. A student might be coming from an urban school where they have previously been educated in their first language as well as English. But because of the low incident schools population, those programs are just not in place. In addition, translation staff is not available. If you're lucky in these districts, the high school world language teacher shares a target language with the new family, but sometimes that's not even the case. This doesn't mean that the teachers, staff, and the administrators are not eager to help these new students and their families. On the contrary, the phone calls and emails I receive from schools that get a new English learner student are desperate. Teachers and administrators are reaching out looking for direction on how they can best help serve these students. Next slide. Lastly, in addition to not having many resources for EL students, oftentimes Wi-Fi or internet resources are not available as well. The school, the library, or maybe a coffee shop in town might be the only places where students can go to get access to the internet. Many times that can be a long drive or even a bus ride away. We would like to know, what are some ways your district has bridged the rural internet divide? If you wouldn't mind sharing suggestions in the chat, Alma can read some of those out as you contribute your ideas.
So Holly, thank you for inviting me to share some of these ideas. Open an internet cafe at a school. The idea of virtual field trips. Excellent, great ideas here. So we're also hearing about built-in Wi-Fi and iPads. District installed Wi-Fi towers near migrant camps. Our district has given out devices with Wi-Fi embedded, and it gives students hotspots. And I'm also hearing about small cohorts, district purchasing devices, and hotspots. So those are some ideas, Holly.
Thank you, Alma. I love the idea about installing Wi-Fi near the migrant camps. Love our migrant folks. I'm glad you're on the call. Next slide, please. So each of our webinars in this series is focused around the use of the English Learner Roadmap as a guiding policy for how we approach the work with English learners in California. Today, we will focus on principles 1 and 2 of the roadmap. If you know the EL roadmap, then you'll recognize some of the statements or guidance that we're providing. And if you haven't yet begun your work around the EL roadmap, we welcome you to visit our website for the link or just Google EL roadmap for access to the documents. There's a link on this slide to the document, so you can always access it later. Next slide, please. On the next few slides, I'm going to provide you with some ideas for how to connect with students. Then I will share some tools for translation so that we can provide you with some translation options and remove some of the fear about communicating with families that maybe don't share your language. Next slide, please. One of the best ways to get to know your students and their families is to conduct a family interview. Taking the time to interview parents, even if it's over Zoom, will help you understand their situation and meet the needs of students in a more complete way. Every person has a story, and each story is unique to that individual. It's important for us as educators to encourage students to share their stories. These could be short stories about how they got their name or longer stories about their family history. Either way, they will provide you with important background into their lives. Goals are another way to gain understanding about your students. These can be academic goals, social goals, or life goals, but this will provide you with a window into their thinking, and then you can work together to help them attain these goals. Next slide. So this is a screenshot from the family interview worksheet. I referred to it in the prior slide. You can see some of the question prompts here that will help you learn more about your students and their families. It lists things such as traditions or preferred family outings that will provide insight into each family. We want to recognize SEAL as one of our colleagues and partners on this document. Next slide, please. So these student-created self-portraits are a great way for students to tap into sharing their identity with the class. As a teacher, you can use this activity as a vehicle for students to reflect on how we are all similar and different, and how students increase their awareness of human diversity. The name acrostic for younger students can be a fun way to demonstrate what words describe them. But for older students, it can also bring about a conversation that allows them to share their name story with the class. Next slide, please. This is a very simple example of how you could have students share their goals for the month or the semester with you or with the class. Of course, these goals become more detailed as the student gets older, but this is a great place to start. Next slide. One strategy that we know helps all students is creating a safe emotional space in your classroom. Every teacher creates their own community for learning in their classroom, and this video linked in the slide helps you to understand what does it mean to be a conscious, active community, and how can you foster this in your classroom? How can I promote equity and allow for a safe space for students to share their ideas and their language and culture with others? Next slide, please. One other way to connect to students is by creating a learning support plan. This document will help you as the teacher to understand what kind of support students currently need. This is something that you could repeatedly visit to gauge how well you, the student, and their families are doing as it pertains to their goals. One teacher shared with me that she was sending weekly Google form links to hear from her students individually, how things were going and what she could do better. Next slide. One thing that we do know from the EL roadmap is that students feel valued when their language is recognized and appreciated in the classroom. When the school views the student's additional language that they bring as an asset to the community, then the student feels validated. One way to allow for that sharing of other languages is to create a chart showing which students bring the asset of a second language to the classroom. When other students, as well as the teacher, take part in learning just one or two words or small phrases in that language, then that starts to build a community of language learners. Next slide, please. When teachers model for other students what it can be like to learn a new language, then they are affirming that the goal for all students in California is to be multilingual. This link will take you to a wonderful video by Dr. Lori Olson on some specific strategies teachers can use in their classroom to further create a community of language learners. I hope you'll be able to watch it after this presentation. Next slide. So I've shared some ideas for what you can do in the classroom or at a school site, but now we'll transition to talking about how you can make that connection. What's the best way to connect if you don't share a language? How can you listen to parents' concerns if you don't comprehend their language? Next slide. So we'll focus mostly on Google Translate in this presentation. There are 3 tools or modes that can be used for translation with Google Translate. I chose Google Translate because it's free, it's readily available, and it can be used without access to the internet. There are detailed instructions on how to use Google Translate on the instructions link in this slide, but I will walk you through the basics. Next slide. I know that Google Translate's not perfect. I'm not here to say that the translations are perfect either, but I will tell you that there are numerous tools that you can use in the app, and they're constantly improving it to make it a better product. You can see from this slide that there are multiple options for Google Translate. I will speak about just 3 of the ways that I have used it as a tool for translation. Next slide. So this is what the app looks like when you open it on your phone. You can see the 2 languages that I have chosen across the top, and you can see the 3 modes: camera, conversation, and transcribe. Each of these can be used in a different way to help you better communicate with families in your classroom. Next slide. We'll start with the conversation tool. This might be the most useful tool that you use with a student in your classroom or when you are having a discussion with a parent. You can open the app, tap the microphone, and take turns speaking. While you speak, the app will translate what you are saying into the target language you have chosen. Don't worry if the person you're talking to doesn't read in their language. The app will read aloud what you have spoken into the phone, as well as transcribe it into written text. Next slide. The camera tool basically works as a scanner. You open the camera option and the app will scan whatever text you're holding over the phone, holding the phone over. This example on the slide is obviously for traveling as it's scanning a street sign. But on the next slide, you will see what I did was use the camera tool over a piece of text in a book. The camera scans the text, in this case written in English, in the book, and then the language that shows up on the screen is in Spanish. I can screenshot this translation and share it with someone, or I can keep it for myself for reference. Next slide. The transcribe tool is the last one I'll talk about, and this one is great for use when you can't get a translator for a presentation or for a back to school night presentation, or you don't have a translator for a parent meeting. This tool will allow the user to open the app, and basically the phone will listen to what is being presented and in real time will translate to the target language on the user's phone screen. Next slide. Talking Points is an additional app that can be used for translation. This works a little differently in that the teacher can send text messages or announcements, typing them in their language, in this example, English, and then the message is received by the parent in their language of preference. So in this example, the teacher writes a message in English and the parent receives it in Spanish. Additionally, the parent can write back in Spanish and it will be translated to English for the teacher to read. Next slide. Okay, last tip for translation, and this is important. Keeping your translations in simple language will allow for more accurate communication. If you're trying to use idioms or humor, those won't necessarily translate well, so just keep your language simple. I hope you will use some of these ideas, and now I will turn the presentation over to Lisa Clark from Fresno to cover strategy 2. Take it away, Lisa.
Thanks, Holly. So Holly just went over some strategies for connecting with learners. So before we can even think about content and language and all of the other things that come with that, we really need to think about connecting with kids. And so thanks, Holly, for those great suggestions. So again, my name is Lisa Clark, and I'm the content coordinator for ELA and ELD at the Fresno County Superintendent of Schools office. Fresno County is a large county with many rural areas. We span all the way up to Hume Lake, up by the creek, Big Creek, to Highway 5. It's an expansive area. So we have lots of rural districts that we serve. So what I'm going to talk about today is some considerations for connecting to learners and talking about some of the access issues that some of our rural students might have. Next slide, please. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples that are real examples. They're not hypothetical that I just pulled off Teachers Pay Teachers today for the sake of this webinar, but these are actual examples that happen to colleagues that I work with. This first example is a lesson that was sent home with one of the students about growing seeds. So I'm going to assume here best intentions, right? We're looking for ways to engage students, to do more hands-on activities, to make things more fun. And so I'm sure that's why this was sent home. But I want you to take a look at just even in the materials that this activity requires. So the very first material, and this is kind of how the conversation between the parent and the student went. So the parent comes home and says, well, what did you get? What do you need to do from school? And the student says, well, I have this assignment. I'm going to be planting a seed. And so they sat down. And so the parent says, okay, so we need a bean seed. Where do we get the bean seed? Where's that? And the student said, well, I guess we have to go get it. Okay. So they go to the next item, toothpicks. So where do we get the toothpicks? I hope I have some toothpicks around here. I'm not really sure. Look at the next item, hand lens. What is a hand lens? I'm assuming magnifying glass, newsprint. What's newsprint? Who talks about newsprint anymore? And so forth. So fortunately for this student, Walmart's just around the corner, and the parent was home and available and had the financial means to go over to Walmart and pick up the supplies that this student needs in order to complete this project. This is a middle school example, but I want you to compare this to the next example that I'm going to show you in the next slide. So this, again, this is not a hypothetical. This is an actual, this is a parent, a colleague that I work with. And I want you to contrast the previous slide with this slide. So also they're going to be planting a seed. And at this particular school, they're not doing things digitally, they're still passing out packets. So understanding that in some of our rural areas, connectivity is so much of an issue that instead of trying to figure that out, they are still doing packets and they are still sending home supplies and activities for the students on a weekly basis where parents have to come to the school and pick those things up. So this is the situation. And so in picture one, you see what the parent picked up when she went for packet pickup. And in picture two, these are all the items that were inside the bag. So there's a jar for the seed. Of course, there's the bean and the baggie, and even the paper towel is included that needs to be moistened and wrapped around the seed to force it to grow. So every little thing was thought of and planned for. In addition, if you see the directions there that came in picture two, I blocked out the teacher's name for privacy, but she did a demonstration on the class YouTube video that students could go to their channel and watch her. She did it step by step because some of our kids, especially in our rural areas, may not have anyone at home to help them. And they try to figure out these things on their own, or they're depending on an older sibling. And so with that, this teacher removed that barrier by creating a visual so the students could go and see what to do. So if you really think about these two examples, this really has nothing to do with grade level. It really is about preparation and access, right? So even if in picture one, or in the previous slide, if a student doesn't have those materials, then they're not going to be able to do the assignment. And it has really nothing to do with engagement, right? And sometimes we think with kindergartners that, you know, we're used to prepping for them anyway. We cut out, we trace, we do all these things, but it's not really even about prepping for them. It's about giving them access to everything. And so there's no concern about having to find a store. You know, in some of the communities where I work at, that I serve, there's a gas station and a mini mart for miles, and that's all that's around. So I love the thoughtful consideration that this teacher put into this project. And think how in the first example for that middle school student, if all of those things would have been provided for them too, then we could be assuring equal access for all of our students. Next slide. And here's another very thoughtful example. This one happened to be for a migrant summer school. Students had a backpack, and take a look at just all the items that are in there, down to the glue sticks, to scissors, to Scotch tape, masking tape. The kids will be doing some projects at home. And so everything that the students would be needing for those projects is included there and very well thought out. So when we're thinking about access to learning, even with choice boards are engaging, fun. We know how important choice is when we're assigning things, but even looking at your choice boards, making sure that our students and our rural students have those things so they really do have choices and they're not just forced to choose a couple of things that they may have around the house instead of equal access to everything. So just things to keep in mind for our rural students. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Angelica as she talks about language concerns. Angelica.
All right, well, thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Holly. And good afternoon, everybody. My name is Angelica Hurtado. I am program manager with San Bernardino County Superintendent of Schools. And I'm gonna share with you some structures or strategies that you can use to provide for your students so they can produce language in the 4 domains of language, which is listening, speaking, reading, or writing. So let's go to the next slide. Before you consider your instruction, we want you to just take a look at these resources that the CDE or the Department of Education has for you. For instance, we have the ELA ELD framework and the California ELD standards. And again, they're available through the California Department of Education. You have the live links there. You also have a live link that will take you to the different typologies for English learners. We want you to know or consider that not all students, not all English learners are the same. So therefore, we need to look at our students. Who do we have in our classroom to better serve them? And this document really goes through the different typologies, key characteristics, and things to consider as you plan your instruction. Next slide. So when you, the first one is language objectives. And we wanted to share this with you because we know that when we provide our students with objectives, your instruction becomes more focused and it lets students know what they will be expected to achieve. So here you see an example of content and language objectives. Keep in mind that verbs for writing content and language objectives are based on Bloom's taxonomy and the 4 domains of language. So for instance, on the left side, you see the content objectives, and the powerful verbs that you see are determine, describe, right? Those are big, powerful verbs. As you look on the right side, you have the language objectives. For instance, you have oral for speaking piece of the learning the language. And so just keeping that in mind, the 4 domains of language. So those are examples that you can kind of go off when you plan your instruction. So the next one. The next one is word banks. And we know that word banks provides English learners with access to the key vocabulary, and it helps with instructional level vocabulary development, spelling, and writing. So word banks can be created by the teacher or students on vocabulary that relates to the core content and academic material the student is learning. So here you have 3 examples of word banks, beginning with the one on the left as a thematic word bank at elementary level, and moving on to the more sophisticated word bank with adjectives. And then the 3rd example over to the right is the secondary one, which is tied to a more specific content area. So the next slide deals with oral interaction. You can provide structured opportunities for your students to develop oral language specifically during online instruction by having students share language with their families. So here on the slide, you see some steps that you can take. For instance, the teacher can pose a question, the student reacts to the question, student shares with their families on the language that they're using, and then the students will post their reaction on their class site. You can notice that it's taking them through the different domains of language as well. And then the link that you see at the top will take you to a video presentation on the different types of oral language that you can view later on your own. Next slide. It's talking about explicit, rich academic language. You can continue to build oral language for your younger students by providing them with images, videos during instruction, perhaps using some TPR, total physical response if needed, thumbs up, thumbs down, or maybe pre-teaching the vocabulary to boost their comprehension. The live link will take you to the Colorín Colorado website, where it will list steps on how to teach vocabulary prior to a read aloud. And also you can record your videos by using Screencastify. Next one. Next one, we talk about chants and rhymes. So the use of chants and rhymes are very helpful for your younger students when they are learning the language, because they have fun as they learn the oral language and vocabulary. The rhythm and the flow of the rhymes are catchy, and students can identify rhyming words. They can learn new vocabulary words. Chants and rhymes can help with oral fluency and even with pronunciation of words and of difficult blends. On the slide, you also see a link to nellyedge.com, which has various resources to choose from. Some are free and some you do have to pay, but you can take a look at what you can use. And then also the link another link that you have there will also take you to a 2nd grade class where they will be chanting. We know that it is a face-to-face class, but I believe you can still do this in your online platform that your district has you using right now. Next slide. We want to talk about sentence starters and how useful they are. You can empower your students to be more confident and proactive as they use specific sentence starters, in particular, in a particular academic topic. So for example, here are some sentence starters from Dr. Kate Kinsella's work on how to ask for assistance or for clarification. I know that when I was in school, and I was learning English, I had difficulties asking my teacher for clarification, and I didn't know if I would be disrespectful if asking them to repeat themselves. So here's some sentence starters to have your students use consistently. You can use various ones depending on what the students are studying, or you can change them to show to what you want them or how you want them to respond, and then also considering their proficiency level. The next one is think alouds. So think alouds are a great way to model what a good reader does in order to understand the text. And here you have the steps that can be taken to practice this strategy. The teacher should always model before having the students do the think alouds independently. So as you can see on the slide, you see this, that during this strategy, teachers verbalize aloud while reading a section of a text orally. And while reading the section, the teacher will model and answer questions like, do I understand what I just read? What were the most important points in this reading? And this is done also engaging the students. Once the teacher models the process, the students can start thinking out loud, and the teacher will provide feedback at the same time and eventually releasing them to do it independently. You also have the resource there at the bottom of the slide. Okay, so the next one is visual vocabulary. A visual vocabulary is a blend of text and images that leads students to better comprehension and retention of a lesson material. This combination of visual and linguistic input are considered visual memory triggers because the student's brain processes the text and image together in a way that builds connections and helps them to remember the concept later on. Students can develop these blends of graphic and linguistic content themselves to help a big concept or keyword stick in their brains. Teacher can model and help collaboratively build them while they learn to develop them on their own. So here you see various examples, for instance, on inertia, force, gravity, acceleration, and so on. And notice the detail in the drawing that students included for each concept. Okay, I believe some teachers are using Jamboard and annotate.net to do this strategy. Next one, we want to cover the Freyer model. This is also one of my favorites. The Freyer model is a graphic organizer for building student vocabulary. This technique requires students to define target vocabulary, give characteristics, and apply their knowledge by generating examples and non-examples, and drawing a picture to illustrate the meaning of the word. Teachers should always model the process for students before allowing them to do it independently. And this strategy is also included in the ELD toolkit, and you have a live link to the document as well there. So the next slide, we want to talk about marginal notes. Marginal notes are intended to help readers identify pertinent information. These notes are usually seen in legal documents or texts. However, this strategy can help students in the secondary summarize their reading and help with comprehension. Marginal notes can also help students paraphrase their understanding by writing notes or making illustrations, icons, etc., to help comprehend text in specific content areas. In this example, you see drawings, words, small word maps that will actually help the reader understand the text in their own way. And I believe some teachers are also using Jamboard and Annotate for this one as well. And the next one, oh, okay, we're at the closing. So those were all our strategies, and we want to thank you for joining us today and giving us the opportunity to share this presentation with you. And as we end today, we want to make sure you continue to keep your head up and keep your heart strong, because you may not know it, but right now you are a hero to your students. Thank you. So now turning it over to Dr. Alma Castro.
Thank you, Angelica. And again, such powerful information. Thank you, Lisa, Holly, and Angelica for sharing such great strategies, ideas, tools, and resources for supporting English learners and families in a rural setting. We invite you to share on the chat box other suggestions of professional learning that you would like to see in the future. We also have placed in the chat box our participant survey. Please be sure to complete your survey, as this is also a requirement for this grant and allows us to continue to provide free webinars to our communities across California. We invite you to our next webinar, which will be on Wednesday, November 18th at 3:15 p.m. on the topic of designated and integrated SLD with GLAD in Espanol, presented by our partners at our Orange County Office of Education. You may register now. The link will be provided in the chat box. Again, we invite you to subscribe to our multilingualcalifornia.org website for updates of upcoming webinars, resources, and events. Today's recorded webinar will be placed on our website along with other resources provided by our presenters. We would like to encourage you to also follow us on social media. Our handles will be placed on the chat box and will be seen through our next slide as well. On behalf of the Multilingual California Alliance, we hope you and your families continue to stay safe, managing the circumstances due to COVID-19. We are thankful that you are here with us today and invite you to our future webinars presented by our partners and our MCAP team. Gracias, que pasen buenas tardes. Good afternoon, have a good rest of your evening. And again, please do not leave without completing your participant survey. We'd like to hear additional information about today's webinar and future topics of other webinars we can present. Thank you for being with us this afternoon.